Hi folks, it's Andrew here at Plainfield Public Library. I'm back with another episode from our daily serial. Today is actually a recorded serial. We've got staffing issues here today that mean I can't do my live broadcast as I usually do. But we're going out at 2 p.m. as usual. We're on to our 7th episode from The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. And in fact, it's chapter 15 of that story. The story is basically one of a governess who's sent to look after some children in a fairly secluded house, with the one stipulation of her employer being that she never bother him about anything that happens. Well, she's become convinced that there are some supernatural visitors, and everybody's getting very vexed and agitated about the possibility that the children are seeing ghosts and that they must be protected from them at all costs. But it is one of those stories where we kind of have an unreliable narrator. We don't know whether it's really in her head that all of this is happening or not. And that really is one of the significant things that the book is known for. Anyway, we're carrying on with the story from chapter 15. The young boy that she's looking after has asked to have her uncle come and look into things to see if he can go back to school because he has apparently been bad, whatever that might mean. Anyway, chapter 15 of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James follows. The business was practically settled from the moment I never followed him. It was a pitiful surrender to agitation, but my being aware of this had somehow no power to restore me. I only sat there on my tomb and read into what my little friend had said to me, the fullness of its meaning. By the time I'd grasped the whole of which I had also embraced for absence, the pretext that I was ashamed to offer my pupils and the rest of the congregation such an example of delay. What I'd said to myself, above all, was that Miles had got something out of me, and that the proof of it for him would be just this awkward collapse. He had got out of me that there was something I was much afraid of, and that he should probably be able to make use of my fear to gain, for his own purpose, more freedom. My fear was of having to deal with the intolerable question of the grounds of his dismissal from school, for that was really but the question of the horrors gathered behind. That his uncle should arrive to treat with me of these things was a solution that, strictly speaking, I ought now to have desired to bring on. But I could so little face the ugliness and the pain of it that I simply procrastinated and lived from hand to mouth. The boy, to my deep discomposure, was immensely in the right, was in a position to say to me, either you clear up with my guardian the mystery of this interruption of my studies, or you cease to expect me to lead with you a life that's so unnatural for a boy. What was so unnatural for the particular boy I was concerned with was this sudden revelation of a consciousness and a plan. That was what really overcame me, what prevented my going on. I walked round the church, hesitating, hovering. I reflected that I had already with him hurt myself beyond repair. Therefore I could patch up nothing, and it was too extreme an effort to squeeze beside him into the pew. He would be so much more sure than ever to pass his arm into mine and make me sit there for an hour in close, silent contact with his commentary on our talk. For the first minute since his arrival, I wanted to get away from him. As I paused beneath the high east window and listened to the sounds of worship, I was taken with an impulse that might master me. I felt completely, should I give it the least encouragement, I might easily put an end to my predicament by getting away altogether. Here was my chance. There was no one to stop me. I could give the whole thing up, turn my back and retreat. It was only a question of hurrying again for a few preparations to the house, with which the attendance at church of so many of the servants would practically have left unoccupied. No one, in short, could blame me if I should just drive desperately off. What was it to get away if I got away only till dinner? That would be in a couple of hours, at the end of which I had the acute prevision my little pupils would play at innocent wonder about my non-appearance in their train. What did you do, you naughty bad thing? Why in the world to worry us so, and take our thoughts off too, don't you know? Did you desert us at the very door? I couldn't meet such questions, nor, as they asked them, their false little lovely eyes. Yet it was also exactly what I should have to meet, that as the prospect grew sharp to me, I at last let myself go. I got so far as the immediate moment was concerned away. I came straight out of the churchyard and, thinking hard, retraced my steps through the park. It seemed to me by the time I reached the house, I'd made up my mind I would fly. The Sunday stillness both of the approaches and of the interior, in which I met no one, fairly excited me with a sense of opportunity. Were I to get off quickly this way, I should get off without seen, without a word. My quickness would have to be remarkable, however, and the question of a conveyance was the great one to settle. Tormented in the hall with difficulties and obstacles, I remember sinking down at the foot of the staircase, suddenly collapsing there on the lowest step, and then, with a revulsion, recalling that it was exactly where more than a month before, in the darkness of night, and just so bowed with evil things, I had seen the spectre of the most horrible of women. At this I was able to straighten myself. I went the rest of the way up. I made, in my bewilderment, for the schoolroom, where there were objects belonging to me that I should have to take. But I opened the door to find again, in a flash, my eyes unsealed. In the presence of what I saw, I reeled straight back upon my resistance. Seated at my own table in clear noonday light, I saw a person, whom without my previous experience I should have taken at the first blush for some housemaid, who might have stayed at home to look after the place, and who, availing herself of rare relief from observation and of the schoolroom table and my pens, ink, and paper, had applied herself to the considerable effort of a letter to her sweetheart. There was an effort in the way that while her arms rested on the table, her hands with evident weariness supported her head. But at the moment I took this in, I had already become aware that in spite of my entrance, her attitude strangely persisted. Then it was with the very act of its announcing itself that her identity flared up in a change of posture. She rose not as if she had heard me, but with an indescribable grand melancholy of indifference and detachment, and within a dozen feet of me stood there as my vile predecessor. Dishonoured and tragic, she was all before me, but even as I fixed and from memory secured it, the awful image passed away. Dark as midnight, in her black dress, her haggard beauty, and her unutterable woe, she had looked at me long enough to appear to say that her right to sit at my table was as good as mine to sit at hers. While these instants lasted, indeed, I had the extraordinary chill of feeling that it was I who was the intruder. It was as a wild protest against it that, actually addressing her, "You terrible, miserable woman," I heard myself break into a sound that, by the open door, rang through the long passage and in the empty house. She looked at me as if she heard me, but I had recovered myself and cleared the air. There was nothing in the room the next minute but the sunshine and a sense that I must stay. Chapter 16. I had so perfectly expected that the return of my pupils, I had so perfectly expected the return of my pupils would be marked by a demonstration that I was freshly upset at having to take into account that they were dumb about my absence. Instead of gaily denouncing and caressing me, they made no allusion to my having failed them, and I was left for the time, on perceiving that she too said nothing, to study Mrs. Groce's odd face. I did this to such purpose that I made sure that they had in some way bribed her to silence, a silence that, however, I would engage to break down on the first private opportunity. This opportunity came before tea. I secured 5 minutes with her in the housekeeper's room, where in the twilight, amid a smell of lately baked bread, but with the place all swept and garnished, I found her sitting in pained placidity before the fire. So I see her still. So I see her best, facing the flame from her straight chair in the dusky, shining room, a large, clean image of the put away, of drawers closed and locked and rest, without a remedy. Yes, they asked me to say nothing, and to please them, as long as they were there, of course I promised. But what had happened to you? I only went with you for the walk, I said. I had then to come back to meet a friend. She showed her surprise. A friend? You? Yes, I have a couple, I laughed. But did the children give you a reason?
Water check.
For not alluding to your leaving us? Yes, they said you would like it better. Do you like it better? My face had made her rueful. No, I like it worse. But after an instant I added, did they say why I should like it better? No, Master Miles only said, we must do nothing but what she likes. I wish indeed he would. And what did Flora say? Miss Flora was too sweet. She said, oh, of course, and I said the same. I thought a moment. You were too sweet too. I can hear you all. But nonetheless, between Miles and me, it's now all out. All out? My companion stared. But what, miss? Everything. It doesn't matter. I've made up my mind. I came home, my dear, I went on, for a talk with Miss Jessel. I had by this time formed the habit of having Mrs. Grose literally well in hand in advance of my sounding that note, so that even now, as she bravely blinked under the signal of my word, I could keep her comparatively firm. A talk? Do you mean she spoke? It came to that. I found her on my return in the schoolroom. And what did she say? I can hear the good woman still, and the candour of her stupefaction, that she suffers the torments. It was this of a truth that made her, as she filled out my picture, gape. Do you mean, she faltered, of the lost? Of the lost, of the damned. And that's why to share them, I faltered myself with the horror of it. But my companion, with less imagination, kept me up. To share them? She wants Flora. Mrs. Grose might, as I gave it to her, fairly have fallen away from me, had I not been prepared. I still held her there to show I was. As I've told you, however, it doesn't matter, because you've made up your mind. But to what? To everything. And what do you call everything? Why, sending for their uncle. Oh, Miss, in pity, do, my friend broke out. But I will. I say it's the only way. What's out, as I told you with Miles, is that if he thinks I'm afraid to, and has ideas of what he gains by that, he shall see he's mistaken. Yes, his uncle shall have it here from me on the spot, and before the boy himself, if necessary, that I'm to be reproached with having done nothing again about more school. Yes, miss, my companion pressed me. Well, there's that awful reason. There were now clearly so many of these from my poor colleague that she was excusable for being vague. But, which? Why, the letter from his old place. You'll show it to the master? I ought to have done so on the instant. Oh, no, said Mrs. Grose with decision. I'll put it before him, I went on inexorably, that I can't undertake to work the question on behalf of a child who's been expelled. For we've never in the least known what, Mrs. Grose declared. For wickedness. For what else, when he's so clever and beautiful and perfect? Is he stupid? Is he untidy? Is he infirm? Is he ill-natured? He's exquisite. So it can be only that. And that would open up the whole thing. After all, I said, it's their uncle's fault. If he left here with such people, he didn't really in the least know them. The fault's mine. She had turned quite pale. Well, you shan't suffer, I answered. The children shan't, she emphatically returned. I was silent a while. We looked at each other. Then what am I to tell him? You needn't tell him anything. I'll tell him. I measured this. You mean you'll write? Remembering she couldn't, I caught myself up. How do you communicate? I tell the bailiff. He writes. And should you like him to write our story? My question had a sarcastic force that I had not fully intended, and it made her after a moment inconsequently break down. The tears were again in her eyes. Ah, miss, you write. Well, tonight, I at last answered, and on this we separated. Chapter 17. I went so far in the evening as to make a beginning. The weather had changed back, a great wind was abroad, and beneath the lamp in my room with Flora at peace beside me, I sat for a long time before a blank sheet of paper and listened to the lash of the rain and the batter of the gusts. Finally I went out, taking a candle. I crossed the passage and listened a minute at Miles's door. What, under my endless obsession, I had been impelled to listen for was some betrayal of his not being at rest, and I presently caught one, but not in the form I had expected. His voice tinkled out. I say, you there, come in. It was a gaiety in the gloom. I went in with my light and found him in bed, very wide awake, but very much at his ease. Well, what are you up to? He asked with a grace of sociability in which it occurred to me that Mrs. Grose, had she been present, might have looked in vain for proof that anything was out. I stood over him with my candle. How did you know I was there? Why, of course I heard you. Did you fancy you made no noise? You're like a troop of cavalry. He beautifully laughed. Then you want to sleep? It's not much. I lie awake and think. I had put my candle designedly a short way off, and then as he held out his friendly old hand to me, had sat down on the edge of his bed. What is it, I asked, that you think of? What in the world, my dear, but you? The pride I take in your appreciation doesn't insist on that. I'd so far rather you slept. Well, I think also, of this queer business of ours. I marked the coolness of his firm little hand. Of what queer business, Miles? Why, the way you bring me up, and all the rest. I fairly held my breath a minute, and even from my glimmering taper there was light enough to show how he smiled up at me from his pillows. What do you mean by all the rest? Oh, you know. I could say nothing for a minute, though I felt as I held his hand and our eyes continued to meet, that my silence had all the air of admitting his charge, and that nothing in the whole world of reality was perhaps at that moment so fabulous as our actual relation. Certainly you shall go back to school, I said, if it be that troubles you, but not to the old place. We must find another, a better. How could I know it did trouble you, this question, when you never told me, never spoke of it at all? His clear, listening face, framed in its smooth whiteness, made him for the minute as appealing as some wistful patient in a children's hospital, and I would have given, as the resemblance came to me, all I possessed on earth, really to be the nurse or the sister of charity who might have helped to cure him. Well, even as it was, I perhaps might help. Do you know, you've never said a word to me about your school. I mean the old one. Never mentioned it in any way. He seemed to wonder. He smiled with the same loveliness, but he clearly gained time. He waited. He called for guidance. Haven't I? It wasn't for me to help him. It was for the thing I had met. Something in his tone and the expression of his face as I got this from him set my heart aching with such a pang as it had never yet known. So unutterably touching was it to see his little brain puzzled and his little resources taxed to play, under the spell laid on him, a part of innocence and consistency. No, never, from the hour you came back. You've never mentioned to me one of your masters, one of your comrades, nor the least little thing that ever happened to you at school. Never, little Miles. No, never have you given me an inkling of anything that may have happened there. Therefore, you can fancy how much I'm in the dark. Until you came out that way this morning, you had, since the first hour I saw you, scarce even made a reference to anything in your previous life. You seemed so perfectly to accept the present. It was extraordinary, and my absolute conviction of his secret precocity, or whatever I might call the poison of an influence that I dared but half to phrase, made him, in spite of the faint breath of his inward trouble, appear as accessible as an older person, imposed him almost as an intellectual equal. I thought you wanted to go on as you are. It struck me that at this he just faintly coloured. He gave, at any rate, like a convalescent slightly fatigued, a languid shake of his head. I don't. I want to get away. You're tired of Bly? Oh, no, I like Bly. Well then, you know what a boy wants. I felt that I didn't know so well as Miles, and I took temporary refuge. You want to go to your uncle? Again at this, with his sweet, ironic face, he made a movement on the pillow. You can't get off with that. I was silent a little, and it was, I now think, I who now changed colour. My dear, I don't want to get off. You can't, even if you do. You can't. He lay beautifully staring. My uncle must come down, and you must completely settle things. If we do, I returned with some spirit, you may be sure it will be to take you quite away. Well, don't you understand that that's exactly what I'm working for? You'll have to tell him about the way you've let it all drop. You'll have to tell him a tremendous lot. The exultation with which he uttered this helped me somehow for the instant to meet him rather more. And how much will you, Miles, have to tell him? There are things he'll ask you. He turned it over. Very likely. But what things? The things you never told me. To make up his mind what to do with you. He can't send you back. Oh, I don't want to go back, he broke in. I want a new field. He said with admirable serenity, with positive, unimpeachable gaiety, and doubtless it was that very note that most evoked for me the poignancy, the unnatural, childish tragedy of his probable reappearance at the end of 3 months, with all this bravado and still more dishonour. It overwhelmed me now that I should never be able to bear that, and it made me let myself go. I threw myself upon him, and in the tenderness of my pity I embraced him. Dear little Miles, dear little Miles. My face was close to his, and they let me kiss him, simply taking it with indulgent good humour. "Well, old lady? Is there nothing at all you want to tell me?" He turned off a little, facing round towards the wall, and holding up his hand to look as if one had seen holding up his hand to look at as one had seen sick children look. I told you this morning." I was sorry for him. "That you just want me not to worry you?" He looked round at me now, as if in recognition of my understanding him, then ever so gently. "To let me alone," he replied. There was even a singular little dignity in it, something that made me release him, yet, when I had slowly risen, linger beside him. God knows I never wished to harass him, but I felt that merely at this to turn my back on him was to abandon, or, to put it more truly, to lose him. "I've just begun a letter to your uncle," I said. "Well then, finish it." I waited a minute. "What happened before?" He gazed up at me. "Before what?" "Before you came back, and before you went away." For some time he was silent, but he continued to meet my eyes. "What happened?" It made me, the sound of the words, in which it seemed to me that I caught for the very first time a small, faint quiver of consenting consciousness, it made me drop on my knees beside the bed and seize once more the chance of possessing him. Dear little Miles, if you knew how I want to help you. It's only that, it's nothing but that, and I'd rather die than give you a pain or do you a wrong. I'd rather die than hurt a hair of you. Dear little Miles. Oh, I brought it out now, even if I should go too far. I just want you to help me to save you. But I knew in a moment after this that I had gone too far. The answer to my appeal was instantaneous, but it came in the form of an extraordinary blast and chill, a gust of frozen air, and a shake of the room, as great as if in the wild wind the casement had crashed in. The boy gave a loud, high shriek, which, lost in the rest of the shock of sound, might have seemed, indistinctly, though I was so close to him, a note either of jubilation or of terror. I jumped to my feet again, and was conscious of darkness. So for a moment we remained, while I stared about me and saw that the drawn curtains were unstirred, and the window tight. "Why, the candle's out!" I then cried. "It was I who blew it, dear," said Miles. Well, that's the end of chapter 17, and that's I've run out of time today. So thank you for joining me today, and I should be back on Wednesday with more from The Turn of the Screw. Thanks for joining me today, and goodbye for now.